Survivor, 1999, by Chuck Palahniuk, is a satirical novel that follows the life of Tender Branson, a member of the Creedish Church, a death cult. The novel's unconventional structure features chapters and pages that count down backward, starting from chapter 47, page 289, and ending with chapter 1, page 1. Members of the Creedish Church are raised to serve others, often working as maids and butlers, and are taught to fear worldly pleasures. Their ultimate purpose is to wait for a divine signal to deliver themselves to God through suicide. The story begins with Tender sitting alone in the cockpit of a hijacked 747, narrating his life into the plane's black box after releasing the crew and passengers. Tender recalls the events that led him here, revealing his past in the Creedish Church. 10 years prior, the cult was involved in a mass suicide, though Tender, like other surviving members, had been sent out into the world as a servant. Even after the mass suicide, surviving members continued to kill themselves, believing that Judgment Day is near. Tender works as a servant for a wealthy couple in Oregon who communicate with him only through speakerphone. Living in a small apartment, he starts receiving calls from suicidal individuals because his phone number was mistakenly published as a suicide hotline. Rather than correcting the error, Tender spreads his number around to keep receiving the calls, offering contradictory advice, sometimes encouraging suicide, sometimes not. As the plot unfolds, Tender meets Fertility, the sister of Trevor, a man he had previously advised to commit suicide. He also attends regular meetings with a caseworker from the Federal Survivor Retention Program, which tracks surviving members of suicide cults. Tender learns that 157 Creedish survivors remain. In the Creedish Church, firstborn sons, always named Adam, stay in the community, while the rest are sent out as servants. Male children after the firstborn are all named Tender, meaning one who tends, and females are called Biddy, implying obedience. Once married, women are referred to as author. The cult members are easily recognizable by their distinct clothing, allowing them to identify one another outside the church. As Tender continues his story, it is revealed that 10 years earlier, the church's secretive practices, such as brainwashing, failure to register births, and tax evasion, were exposed, leading local Nebraska police to involve the FBI. The impending federal crackdown triggered the mass suicide of the Creedish leadership. After meeting Tender, Fertility calls the crisis hotline, unaware that it's him on the other end. Tender recognizes her voice, but disguises his own, while Fertility, who is psychic, knows she is speaking to Tender but doesn't reveal it. She talks about her brother Trevor's suicide and mentions meeting a strange man named Tender, who reminded her of a cult member. She speculates that Tender might have been her brother's former lover. The conversation takes an uncomfortable turn when Fertility asks for phone sex, prompting Tender to abruptly end the call. He avoids answering the phone afterward, fearing she may call again and prefer the anonymous version of him over his real self. In a meeting with his caseworker, Tender vents his frustrations and half-jokingly asks her to help him by cleaning his home. Surprisingly, she finds comfort in this task after years of dealing with suicide survivors. She reveals that many of the cult suicides were actually murders staged to push remaining survivors into taking their own lives. Tender and Fertility meet again, and she reveals that Trevor was also psychic. Soon after, Tender receives a mysterious phone call informing him that the murdered survivors were killed by someone within the Creedish cult. During a date with Fertility, a stranger taunts them with comments about the mass suicide. Tender recognizes the man as his twin brother, but the stranger denies knowing him. Fertility, who can foresee the future, takes Tender to a department store, warning him that it will catch fire, but reassuring him that they won't be harmed. She confides that, like her brother, she dreams of future events. As the story progresses, Tender becomes one of the last two known survivors of the Creedish Church. He and the caseworker search through photos of deceased cult members, trying to identify the other survivor. Tender knows it's his twin brother. The caseworker is later overwhelmed by toxic chemicals while cleaning a fireplace, chemicals secretly mixed by Tender's brother, who had intended to kill Tender. Afterward, the brother steals the caseworker's Creedish Church suicide files. The police, suspecting Tender in her death, force him to flee to New York. A series of events follows, including Tender gaining public fame and Fertility becoming pregnant before leaving for Australia. Tender discovers in her planner that a plane is destined to be hijacked and crash in the Australian outback. This revelation brings the story full circle to the novel's beginning, where Tender realizes he is the hijacker. The novel concludes ambiguously, leaving it uncertain whether Tender survives the crash. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like if you did, and be sure to subscribe. Thank you.